Welcome to a special edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We've teamed up again with Government Analytics to take a look at the state of the economy with special guest Kevin Page. He was Canada's first parliamentary budget officer. Hello, everyone. I'm Pamela Wallin, a senator from Saskatchewan, and I have the pleasure today of being your fiscal anchor through this conversation that we are going to have on the state and fate of the Canadian economy in the midst of coronavirus. We are so pleased at the behest of Government Analytics to be here. We've got also with us on the line Greg MacDougall and Steve Saunders. They are Government Analytics, the guys that crunch all those numbers. And we have our very special guest today, Kevin Page. Now, he is presently a professor of political science at the University of Ottawa, head of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, which is a think tank at the university. Kevin worked as a civil servant for many years across departments: finance, treasury board, privy council, fisheries, agriculture, etc. And in 2008, he became Canada's first parliamentary budget officer, serving from 2008 to 2013. It was his job to invent the job and invent the office. And I'd like to begin, if I could, Kevin, with just a little bit of history. What was your philosophy and the understanding of what your philosophy should be at the time?
Thank you, Senator. Actually, it's great to be with you. So, my understanding of the philosophy was really, it really comes from the mandate that was in legislation. That was to be a budget officer for Parliament, to provide this independent analysis that they might not have seen before on trends in the economy, just costing of government legislation, and just help with the overall approval of authorities for spending and taxes. So, and the philosophy that I had was really to be as transparent as possible, to bring analysis to parliamentarians and do our best to explain it.
I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I think it was in the first year in 2009, that there was actually a parliamentary committee that said everything that you produce should be approved by MPs before it's published. Was that actually a recommendation?
Yes, that came from a joint committee, House and Senate of the Library of Parliament. The office originally was located in the Library of Parliament as part of the Library of Parliament. Certainly, which was a good starting place, again, when we look back. But the philosophy of trying to be independent, but having all our reports approved by MPs really didn't connect very well with me.
And you did have a decent budget, but you also, I think, experienced some budget cuts in the first iteration of this organization. Where does it stand now?
Yeah, it's a much expanded office now, Senator. It's several-fold bigger than what we were in terms of just manpower. The mandate has expanded. It's now an independent officer of Parliament. I was an independent officer of the Library of Parliament. It has, the mandate's been expanded beyond the things I mentioned to include costing of platforms. It's a much bigger office, and it's got a good reputation around the world, I'm happy to say.
Yes, it absolutely does. All right, let's get into some of the substance of where we are. I know I read what your words after the recent throne speech, basically saying that difficult conversations are almost never about getting the facts right. They're about conflicting perceptions, interpretations of value and values. This is difficult when we're talking about actual numbers. Can you give us your just overall view of where we sit right now as an economy?
Yeah, as an economy, we have, we as data people, we're always a little bit behind in the data. We rely on Statistics Canada, which is a great independent organization. So we have data that pretty much takes us through the summer, but not very far into the fall. And when you look at the latest data, we're in a very, very serious recession. Something like of the likes I have not seen in my lifetime, that really, you have to compare a recession much deeper than 2008-9, much deeper than the recessions of the early 90s and early 1980s. Probably something, and it'll be in the neighborhood for 2020, the neighborhood of 7% in terms of decline in GDP. We have these incredible vibrations in labor market statistics. We've seen the unemployment rate go from just under 6% to well over 13%, back down to 9%. But for people like you and I who live in small towns, who grew up in small towns, if you look at just the employment numbers, we're some 700,000, 800,000 fewer employed than we were since last February. So a lot of these reports from PBO or from the Government of Canada, Finance Department, IMF talk about scarring. There's a lot of scarring going on in terms of labor markets, in terms of investment in businesses, and just global relations.
When you talk about a recession like you've not seen, where are we on the continuum till you start to use the word that begins with a D, which is depression?
Yeah, I don't think economists or statisticians really have defined that tipping point or that pivotal point where you move from. So some of those recessions that we had in the 2000s, early 1990s, 1980s were declines of about 4 or 5% in that range in terms of real GDP. So we're talking about something that's twice as big as that in terms of output declines. We're somewhere in between a serious recession and what unfortunately people experienced in the 1930s, our grandparents.
We are talking about deficit figures, $350 billion.
Yeah, so $350 billion is an enormous number. The last number that we saw, the largest deficit we had was in the 2008-9 financial crisis. We saw a deficit of just under $60 billion. That included a lot of supports for fiscal stimulus during that recession. So $350 billion, we're about a $2 trillion economy. It's in that 15-16% range of GDP. We've never seen anything like it in our lifetime.
Government analytics, Greg and Steve, have been tracking all federal, provincial, and territorial spending, and that total exceeds $1 trillion, which of course accounts for some of the deficit numbers, but does not explain the continuing rise of unemployment with that much federal and provincial spending going on.
Yeah, so I think there's probably different ways that people, like government analytics and others, can carve up these numbers. Like, how do you go from a deficit last year of say $35 billion to a deficit in the $350 billion range? And then, even beyond like the direct fiscal supports that are well in excess of $200 billion, there's, a lot of stuff that doesn't impact the balance sheet, but I'm pretty sure that government analytics will look at. These are tax deferrals, these are liquidity measures that run through the Bank of Canada or through some of our crown corporations.
Let's just get into that for a moment, the Bank of Canada, because what we have seen them doing is very actively, to use the parlance, printing money, but really buying up the debt of the federal government and the provincial and territorial governments, because it's not great debt, and who out there wants to buy it? Can we continue to do that at the level that they're doing it? Of course, that's the bank does that all the time, but this is extraordinarily high. At the same time as we see the Bank of Canada really getting into the whole, talking publicly about social policy matters, and whether it's the environment or the need for continued supports over the long term for the population. Can these things, is this a new role that's being carved out, or is it in reaction to crisis?
Yeah, I think, Senator, I think it's more a reaction to crisis, but it is certainly new in terms of just the sheer scale of the numbers is new. So this discussion of quantitative easing, like when the bank putting government securities on its balance sheet, certainly took place in 2008-9 in a very serious way, not just in Canada really, but around the world. But I think just the amount of it is makes it feel like it is new. So we're talking, like, you could see weekly statistics from the Bank of Canada. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, again, in a $2 trillion economy, just the expansion of the government's bank sheet. And we're moving into areas that go beyond federal securities, provincial and municipal securities, a lot of some commercial securities as well. So it's a much bigger role for the bank in terms of stabilization policy. And so it's a discussion that we're having now about what is the future role of the bank. There's a renewal of their mandate is taking place now. We moved a long ways away from inflation targeting into something much more focused on stabilization of an economy in very unstable times.
Just before I ask you about that inflation rate, I just want to put it in the broader context. Is the spending and the activity on the part of government sustainable? And is the activity of the Bank of Canada, as we've just discussed, is that sustainable?
It's not sustainable at the current pace. So, but again, I think it's really, it can only be understood in the context of an economy that literally fell off the cliff in the second quarter of 2020 in Canada and around the world because of the need that was expressed by public health officials that we had to lock down the economy to spread to slow the transmission of the virus. So it's only in that context you can understand these numbers that we're talking about. It's not sustainable. So we can't. I think it's impossible to think of running back to back deficits in the $350 billion range, 15 percentage points of GDP, with and the just continued expansion of central bank balance sheets at this rate. So I mean, I think as we start to see these projections going forward, we see unwinding of these supports. We see, in many cases, the role of the banks in terms of buying up these securities, easing pressure off the financial markets. They take their foot off the gas pedal, and hopefully we'll see, by 2022-23, a very different environment, much more a normal period of time.
This argument, however, is still raging. We see it stateside, of course, but we see it in this country, the differences amongst and between the provinces about the degree to which you must reopen or have to reopen, and the question of locking down to save every single life you can. There's no good argument, but I'd like to know where you land on it.
Yeah, it's again, it's before this program started, we were talking about the debate in the United States last night between President Trump and Vice President Biden, and that was the two visions were quite clear there in the United States: a president that wants to reopen the economy, a vice president that wants to listen very closely to what public health officials are saying and reopen, but prepared to kind of shut down if need be. So yeah, I guess there's a large gray line, I think, on this area with respect to the transmission of the virus. I think as we head towards the end of 2020 and we see a number of possibilities with respect to vaccines, and we assume that somewhere early in 2021 we'll be distributing these. There'll be vaccinations taking place around the world, and it'll take some period of time. But I think we're more in the world reopening. And we've seen already just the reopening of the economy from the second quarter, a big bounce backs in many sectors. There's some sectors like retail, trade that are actually higher now than what they were at pre-COVID levels. And there's other sectors of the economy that weren't really even affected, like insurance and real estate, for example, have seemed to kind of gone through. And then there's sectors of the economy that we're all familiar with, accommodation, air transportation, food industries, that are double-digit levels below what they were just months ago, in the pre-COVID period. So again, it's this recovery is going to be bouncy. It's not going to be the same across all sectors. As we were to find ourselves in a major spike before that, it will slow the reopening of the economy.
I think one of the problems, and you referred to it, when you live in a smaller place, everything is much more visible, whether it's the presence of the virus or what's actually happening on the ground. One of the things that I saw was that the one-size-fits-all policy doesn't work, because what's happening in a city in Regina or Saskatoon is not the same in Wadena, Saskatchewan, population 1,300, right? It's the same across Ontario. huge cities like Toronto with suburbs that have big infection numbers and increasing infection numbers, and small communities that are not touched by the virus. Have we got any more sophisticated in how we're responding to this?
I think we certainly, as you know, as a country, I think citizens, we've learned. Most of us, we're learning as we go, because it's, this type of pandemic, it's the nature of it, the breadth of it, the seriousness that we haven't really experienced in over 100 years. So it's all new to us. But I think we're adapting. I think most of us. Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. So, could you please repeat it? We're becoming much more comfortable with. It was just the advice from public health officials, the wearing of masks, the cleaning of hands, the social distancing. So we are practicing this. We're seeing businesses across the country, whether big cities or small cities, adapting to because the need to stay open. So yeah, it's not one size fits all, but also again with improvements in testing, I think we could find out where the spikes are taking place. We can address those spikes, and so I think there's been a lot of adaptation over the past 6, 7, 8 months.
Okay, I'm going to try and come back a little bit to the numbers. And one of the questions that I had a mark beside for myself, which was all this quantitative easing, all of the purchasing by the Bank of Canada of debt, et cetera, et cetera. One would assume interest rates would be going up at that point. They're not. What's your explanation?
Yeah, I think earlier this year, the former Federal Reserve Chairman, Mrs. Yellen, said that the big game changer in 2020 is interest rates. And it's, when people study the economics of deficits, it's the fundamental game changer to understand deficits and debt in 2020 versus when my time in the Department of Finance in the 80s and 90s. So interest rates are they're almost zero. Policy rates in the bank are just, effectively zero, literally overnight rates at 25 basis points. We've got, you look at the term structure of interest rates, the short-term treasury bills, long-term government bonds, these are, they're just at basis points. They're very, they're less than 50 basis points, both of them. So, it allows, and the reason for this, there's probably twofold. One, there is no inflation in the economy there is, from a central bank perspective, there is no price pressure, no upwards inflationary pressure. There's deflationary pressure. And so just enormous weakness in the economy. These are historic output gaps where the economies are vis-a-vis potential. And I think lastly, I think central bankers they're quite scared. There's so much debt, both in the public sector and in the private sector. In the private sector, both non-financial and household, that they know that the impact of raising interest rates in this environment would be catastrophic with this amount of debt, and it would really potentially turn this recession that we talked about into a depression, certainly a financial crisis, which a lot of people do expect. Internationally, we probably will have some financial reckoning in different parts of the world, in the next year or two, just particularly in lower income countries. But so, yeah, these interest rates are going to stay very low because there's no inflation, and because central bankers know that the impact of raising rates would be just horrific on the economy.
What's your assessment of two things? We're witnessing, certainly in the larger cities, a real estate bubble. All of this activity, some people saying it's the result of changing lifestyle needs or wants because of the crisis, the COVID crisis, that people want to change their lifestyles. Others saying it's just a straight up numbers game. As long as interest rates are this low, this is the time to buy, and it's fueled this. What do you think's going on?
Yeah, certainly in a number of cities and housing markets, we're seeing what looks like a bubble. And that's really created from just a lack of supply. There's just so little movement in the markets. There's so little turnover. People are not moving. They're staying at home in large degrees. And so, for those first-time home buyers, it's almost impossible to get in the market. There are bidding wars in cities like Ottawa, but also other cities as well. So really, I think from a supply and demand perspective, it's mostly really just limited supply that is affecting these prices. I would assume that this will sort itself out over the next year or so, that ultimately, like housing prices, if you look at the long arc, they kind of move with the economy. And, so these bubbles that we see in certain cities, they'll have to unwind. So I think people should be careful if they find themselves in bidding wars right now. But if you look at some of those really big cities, Pamela, like Senator Vancouver, Toronto, it's just, you look at the debt numbers that people are taking on, the amount of mortgage debt, like that is not sustainable. And so that is a big fear that central bankers have.
Talk to me a little bit about the stock markets and your analysis of them.
Yeah, I'm probably not the right person to talk about the stock market. There are all kinds of great quotes from people about how inaccurate they predict, events. I definitely think in certain areas, like certainly in the case of the United States, that big tax reductions and all this liquidity that's been put out by banks, by the Federal Reserve, is really found its way into those financial markets, into equity markets. It's really boosted up prices. I think again, there's so much change that's going to take place in the economy over the next few years as we kind of sort through COVID-19. How do we deal with the pandemic, and then we start to deal with other very big challenges. That I think there'll be a big correction in the marketplace. It's people need to be careful about putting their money, I think, in equity markets. But again, no one should take the advice from Kevin Page
on just that topic. We'll
be a few other topics.
Just we have gone now for the longest period, I think, in Canadian history without a federal budget. I gather what we're going to get, although it's a movable object, is some kind of fiscal update. Can you give us your sense of whether or not the kind of spending that we're seeing is actually properly targeted at this point to people in need? I could tell you lots of stories about people that I run into that, the wealthier people, the people who have an accountant can figure out how to access rent subsidies and CERB payments and all of those kinds of things. Regular, ordinary working people are having a hell of a time doing it. And then programs, we've seen again this week, some very, very troubling numbers on infrastructure spending that we don't know where it's going. It's not accounted for. It's certainly not targeted. Is it working? It gives you kind of the sense that the government's throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks.
Yeah, so I think almost like two very big issues there that you've raised, Senator. One that deals with the fiscal supports and what happens to these fiscal supports as we go into 2021, and we're still dealing with these spikes in infection rates, and then these other more fundamental issues like infrastructure. I would say on the fiscal support side, again, the numbers are staggering in terms of how much money went out the door in such a short period of time. Hundreds of billions of dollars, again, in the context of a $2 trillion economy, dozens upon dozens of various programs. A lot of the money did flow through two really big programs, the CERB program, Emergency Response Benefit Program, and the Wage Subsidy Program. But I think there is a lack of transparency, I would argue, Senator, that around the evolution of these programs. I think in Parliament, we've seen this discussion. Do we need a committee that's really more focused? We need more details. Or is the government's response working? I know I've been some connection with various media outlets. They're trying to find out what are the cash flows month by month in these programs? Who are the clients? Again, this conversation, both with respect to households, but also businesses, who is getting that money? How does it break out by sector, by income level, by region? And there's really little, you have to work very hard to get any information on these sort of month-to-month cash flows. So I think that's important from an accountability perspective, but also I think it's important that we want Parliament, all of the opposition parties to be fully engaged on what is the right package of programs for 2021 for their constituents. And so we can't have that debate, a rich debate, unless we really know how that money is impacting. And ironically, again, I definitely found myself in a difficult place with Prime Minister Harper's government in 2009-10 with respect to tracking stimulus programs. But to the credit of Prime Minister Harper, he was quite transparent. He was pushed by the Parliament parties to need to have quarterly reports. And I think those reports were very valuable. And I think Prime Minister Harper was rewarded in 2011 with a majority government. I think in this current context, we don't have anything like the quarterly reports. So we don't really know the flows of these monies, again, by the level of cash flows month by month, again, who are these clients that are receiving Canadians and businesses that are receiving this money. So we're not having that debate. And I think, again, I think we need the opposition parties to be successful. On infrastructure, I think we have a long-standing problem there. I think Canada is finding themselves, behind the curve with respect to other countries like the UK, which have launched national needs assessments. They're working towards national plans, sectoral plans, strong performance frameworks, just much better data around these assets and the investments that are going against these assets. So better decisions and more due diligence. It's a long-standing problem. I think Minister McKenna, she's definitely, our infrastructure minister is aware of it, but hopefully we deal with it in the context of the 2021 budget.
But again, and it's been particularly clear, I think, in the infrastructure file, although there's been some moves by government to clean up the infrastructure bank and bring in new management at the top, if you will. And perhaps that will start to change. But the issue is the same, and others have raised that with me today, knowing that we were going to have this discussion. Senator Elizabeth Marshall, who is very keen, watches government spending like a hawk. She says, or asks, does government actually have the information that all of those things that you've just described about who's getting it, where, how much, what's the flow, what are the quarterly looks like? Does government have that information? They won't share it, or it's just been going out the door at such a rate they don't even know?
Yeah, again, I think again, two conversations. One, the infrastructure on one side, which is kind of I think needs to be a big part of a recovery package, and we need to get to a better place. But I think with respect to the the month-by-month payments on these big programs like the Canada Emergency Response Benefit Program, the wage subsidy, rental assistance programs, I think there are, et cetera. There are, I think departments do have this data. And so they are, maybe they could be a little bit behind in collating that data in a way that really would explain to Canadians what is the impact and where's this money going? Is it really going to the right sectors? But you can, if you look really long and hard and deep, like you can find various pieces of that data. I think on the case of SERB program, for example, like StatsCan publishes, I think it's a monthly basis. Who are those recipients? And it's broken down by province, I think perhaps even by age. And again, so we know that there's monies attached to those numbers of recipients, but we're not getting that data. So again, I think opposition parties, they should put together a frame. This is what we need to see to track this month by month. Again, these departments, they need to work with a receiver general that basically every month there's a trial balance for these departments. They're responsible to provide that financial data by program. There's dozens and dozens of fiscal support programs. This data is being captured, but we are not seeing it.
I just want to encourage people, if they are attending and part of our webinar today, please put your questions forward. I have a million, but I would like to include yours as well. And you can just use the chat function there, and I will actually be able to read them and ask Kevin Page for answers. I want to take on this topic for a moment, the whole question of fiscal anchor, which I referred to earlier. What are and what are we doing now? I think for a long time we heard politicians on both sides of the political divide talk about the debt to GDP ratio, and that was how you judged how well your economy was doing. It didn't much matter about the debt and deficit numbers per se. It was just the ratio that mattered. And now, of course, that is gone out the window and is a very, very distorted number. So what do we do? How do we create some kind of fiscal anchor here? In the old days, it was gold, tying your currency to gold. What are people like you thinking about that issue today?
Yeah, it's. I think there was a way of thinking around this discussion of anchors or targets or rules before COVID-19, and now we find ourselves in this period of time where it's like there's so much uncertainty. It's like we can feel like we're without any kind of anchor, target, or rule. but I think there's a sense from a lot of experts in this country, and I think Canada's blessed. We have, these great former public servants like David Dodge, Don Drummond, or Scott Clark, Peter DeVries, that the true experts that provide this sort of advice. I think our lessons learned from the 80s and 90s in Canada, and perhaps around the world, is that governments there's a certain bias with respect to deficits. If they can have their way, they'd rather not raise taxes, so they're happy to pile up the debt. So I think there's a sense that they need to be anchored in something. And looking at debt over the medium term relative to income is a very common sort of anchor. So you can't, from year to year, you get these fluctuations, you can get thrown off. But some sense of being like a yacht person, I'm not somebody that has a yacht, but you want, if you're, or maybe a fisherman who wants to kind of find his favorite fishing spot, they want to throw an anchor overboard. They want to be in that zone. And so for different countries, Canada is a very wealthy country. When you look at our per capita incomes, our standings in these UN indices with respect to human development. If you look at bond rating agencies, even with our debt levels, even including in this current environment, we still get the highest investment grade from the major debt rating agencies. So, but we know that as we look ahead to the next budget, we're going to need a new medium-term fiscal anchor, and it probably will be linked to debt to income. There will be all kinds of, we'll probably need some kind of operational role to keep governments honest. That's something that we've been kind of missing, I think, but under the Liberal government since 2015, where pretty much they just operate on a declining debt to GDP ratio. And I think as long as the economy was growing, if there were any positive upside surprises with respect to revenues, they spent it. And so we found ourselves with this sort of steady flow of deficits and people scratching their head, are we really getting value for money? So and I think there's been all kinds of ideas about how to operationalize that, but really at the end of the day, what does government control? There's some level of discretionary spending, which is about half of their overall program spending. They could, they will have to control spending in a much better way as we move towards the medium term. And other people like David Dodge have focused on the carrying costs of debt, which is really a number that is, I think most Canadians would be very surprised to learn that the carrying cost of debt is going down while we're adding hundreds of billions of dollars to our stock of debt. It's mind-boggling unless you actually sit down with a piece of paper and kind of wrap your head around what's happening to the stock of debt and why are these interest rates going so low. But that's really been the case. The effective rate on carrying cost of this debt has been declining steadily since the 2008-9 financial crisis. So our interest rate is going down, and really it's at record lows. And so we're adding to the stock of debt, but the public debt interest charges in nominal terms is not going up. It's less than half of what it was in the mid 1990s right now, even though the stock of debt is hundreds of billions higher.
And this leads to this discussion that some parts of the political spectrum are engaged in, the modern monetary theory, which is as long as interest rates are low, just keep on spending. We can't afford not to. We should just keep doing it. That, to me, that's frightening, because there will be a day of reckoning.
I agree, Senator. And again, but I think for me anyways, I find comfort knowing that it's important. I mean, it was a good thing that we had this sort of fiscal room or fiscal space to help Canadians, both in 2008-9, when we were in a world global financial crisis, and now even in a much more serious global pandemic. So we're helping people. And, so these supports are preventing people, they're reducing the amount of insolvencies, bankruptcies, they're reducing the amount of credit delinquencies. And so we haven't seen any movement in those numbers. And it's really thankful because the government is using its credit card. But going forward, you're absolutely right that we have to be very careful, because this debt will be passed on to future generations.
All right, we have a question here from Michelle Pamels, if I'm saying that right, CEO of Credit Counseling Canada. I'll just read aloud, Kevin. To what extent is government looking at the models in the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, who together have invested 115 million, I think that number might be bigger, but 150 million in financial help services to supplement their COVID-19 relief, to address the debt burden facing Canadians? In other words, a longer-term strategic approach to the debt question. Again, a question from Michelle from Credit Counseling Canada.
That's a great question. Yeah, I can't think of a program, an announcement yet. Maybe we'll see it in the fall update. Around, because governments are well aware that there's a massive amount of debt that has been built up even prior to COVID. And again, it remains to be seen how much more household debt will be generated through this sort of these pandemic years, 2020 and 2021. So there's been some efforts in the past by governments to to improve financial literacy, these sort of counseling that many people are going to need. I think it's a great idea. We could see a program. That would be a good idea for the finance minister, Minister Freeland, to kind of think about something like that in the fall update or budget.
Thanks, Michelle, for that question. I want to come back to this issue of what we are seeing. You referenced it earlier, the notion of some industries like airlines and the hospitality industry just being absolutely decimated. Companies like Amazon, of course, doing really well with people ordering things. How much of what we are seeing, and it may be impossible to predict while we're in the middle of it, but how much of what we are seeing is fundamental structural change, and how much of it is dealing and coping with a crisis?
Wow. Yeah, that's, again, you're asking me these hard questions again. Now I really am starting to feel like Donald Trump in 60 Minutes. Might have to.
Oh, I'm way nicer than that.
You are way nicer. Yeah, I mean, it's really, there's been a lot of talk about how certain trends like digitalization, how it's just, it just like on steroids now. Like, we're having this discussion over Zoom. I've taught courses this year completely on Zoom. Webinars, everything on Zoom. I'm actually working from home today. I've spent a couple of days in the office, but when I go to the office at the University of Ottawa, it's like other universities across the country. They're pretty much empty vessels. So, and then you drive through these cities. As I drive through the city of Ottawa, but others, it's again, the roads are not busy. All the restaurants that sit underneath these office towers are empty or closed up. So people are working in a different way. So I think. Yeah, I just was reading articles today in our local paper about the city of Ottawa, the amount of money that's going to be lost because of lower transit and transit fares. So a massive amount of adjustments. And, people worried about, is it wrong to invest in public transit? Are we fundamentally going to start working in a different way? Like, again, this is not, by any sense of expertise, but I would assume a lot of this goes back. Like, we are social animals. People love to go to restaurants. People love to be with other people. It's just who we are as citizens. So I assume a lot of it goes back, but not completely. Like a lot of these international travel meetings that some of us will do, now I think we'll do less of it. We'll do some of it, but it'll be much less. I think there will be a lot more people working from home in the future that, that have these sort of white collar type jobs. I grew up in a blue collar kind of, family. So like, those people are still going to, they're going to go to the construction sites and the manufacturing plants, et cetera. A massive amount of changes. So what is structural and what is cyclical sort of thing that I think we won't really know. It could take years before we really know. But like I read a piece as well very recently where universities literally changed on a weekend. The business models literally changed on a weekend, going from, we'll have people in classrooms to everybody's going to stay, there'll be nobody in classrooms. But I think, people are going to reassess, like, what's the quality of that? How important is that interaction? Is teaching the same way in a classroom? Our business meetings, how much time do we need to spend with our colleagues in different parts of the world? And there'll be an adjustment. So, I can't give you a number, how much is structural, how much is cyclical, but it's a big game changer.
If we see the current situation continue and we've got airlines in this country, we are a huge, geographically speaking, country. I mean, just when you think about MPs and senators alone who have to, on a weekend, commute to Iqaluit or Prince Edward Island or Saskatchewan, it's a complicated and costly exercise. Airlines in very serious trouble. Should the government actually consider, and I'm kind of cringing as I say it, equity investments in these operations? Should it stay strictly as a bailout? How do we reconcile that with some of the the green policies that the government promotes at this time. There's an industry that really speaks to all of those issues in one place.
Correct. Yeah, yeah. Again, those numbers you can look at. What's happening to the airline industry. You go to Statistics Canada website, look at the output numbers. You could track down the airline industries. You could see that there's the enormous how they have not recovered. There's been no bounce back or very little bounce back, almost no bounce back really in the airline industry. I think we can all recall that in the 2008-9 financial crisis, the automobile sector was in dire straits. They needed, big loans. There were, some equity involvement of governments to some of the companies. To a large extent, we saw that the auto industry did recover. The government got its money back for the most part, even after writing it off, it got money back. So, again, there are going to be different opportunities. I don't think we've seen the support yet for the airline industry. We have not seen it. It's a sector that's going to need massive support. I think people like me want to see senators like you traveling across the country, like working in Ottawa, but participating in other, conversations with Canadians, looking at policy issues. We want you to be crisscrossing the country, not working the way we're working right now. So I hope a lot of it comes back. We got to save our airline industry. It still will be a big part of the future. And yeah, we need to find ways to make even our airline industry and other industries more green.
I come from a farming community, and of course what we saw is in the middle of the pandemic that the increase in the carbon tax went ahead. There was no consideration for the impact of that on farmers at a time when they were already drying grain from the previous year, like a very costly point. Now we're talking about a second kind of carbon tax on that. And I guess I'll put it in the broader context of taxation in general. Is that a way to try and deal with the extraordinary numbers we're all going to be dealing with in terms of debt and deficit? Can we get it back that way? Or do we really have to grow our way out of this?
Yeah, I think this issue of the confluence of dealing with a pandemic and then knowing that climate change is a major issue. Again, behind both the pandemic, we have public health, we have scientists, and the scientists are giving us strong advice to deal with the pandemic, and we're getting strong advice from climate change scientists, climate scientists as well. So we know that they're both, serious issues. I think, being counters, people like some of my colleagues can look at like the cost to the economy of a pandemic in terms of loss of life or loss of economic output. But in the same way, we also know that these greenhouse gas emissions are being reduced this year because we've shut down these economies. And we can also look at, when you look at the numbers, it's an incredibly costly way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions when you look at the loss of life and loss of industry. My sense is that we have to put a price on carbon. Again, it's hard on these industries. We have to make sure that people like farmers or people that other low-income people are fully protected. But we need to see these prices. We partly got into this problem, or we largely got into this problem because we avoided putting prices on these carbon emissions. So I think there's no way around it. Whether we do it through cap and trade or through carbon taxes, I think the advice from some of my colleagues like Chris Reagan and McGill, the Eco-Fiscal Commission, is that carbon taxes are a much better way. And that, I think these scientists that look at it, economists that look at the numbers, and I'm not one of them, but we're talking about increases in these carbon taxes, in the $50 to $200 range over the next 10 years. So it's a big adjustment that we have to face. So I think people at finance departments, environmental departments across the country, federally, provincially, are wrapping their heads around how do we make these adjustments over the next 3 years. Is there going to be a green shift component to the recovery plan? I think there should, and that should include infrastructure, and it should include subsidies for various industries that need to be protected. More regulations. And we don't have a plan. The government promised a plan in the SFT for 2030, and we promised a 2050 plan in terms of getting to zero net emissions. But yeah, we're going to need to see those plans as well. And we're all struggling with one crisis right now, but we know that this other crisis, every bit is existential for the Canadians.
I guess the obvious follow-up there, though, is when we hear from the government the importance of this recovery and rebuild having to be green, at the same time kind of leaving the oil and gas sector floundering on its own. And I will throw in agriculture as well, because they've not been the recipients of aid. Can you do those things without supporting those two key sectors, which are very fundamental to the economy's functioning, to the creation of GDP?
Yeah, I mean, the oil and gas sector is probably 10% of our economy. Agriculture, a smaller proportion, but I mean, we all depend on food on our table. And so it's absolutely a vital industry. I think those industries are going to need a lot of supports. I think there's this broader ideological discussion about the role of the state going forward and how is that connected to the deficits. Was that part of that debate last night between President Trump and Vice President Biden? I think it is. I think, again, I'm not somebody that, that really is that sophisticated in these ideological discussions, but I think we will see for a period of time an expansion of the role of state. I think, those sectors, oil and gas, they're going to get smaller, not bigger. If we're going to get to zero net emissions, they're still going to exist decades and decades from now, but they will not. We can't allow the sectors to kind of grow. We need to grow our renewable sector much faster. So, but they need massive amounts of supports. And yeah, are we prepared to support them? I hope we are.
We have a question from Bernie Etzinger here, and this is a large question. Are the pandemic financial impacts a pension and public sector issue in disguise?
Again, could it be that we swell the deficits and debt to such a point that that at least public service pensions they become jeopardized? Right now, I mean, public service and and other mostly public servants benefit from these incredibly rich pensions. And could it be that that we need to as part of a broader restraint exercise, some austerity exercise years down the road, that that component needs to be looked at? I think that's probably fair game. Again, I don't know that we would probably do something like that over the next year or two where the economy is so weak. But I think there is a case for a spending review of the likes that perhaps we saw in the 1990s to get to a debt level relative to income that we feel more comfortable with. Again, if you look at the supports that we saw in 2008, 9, and 2020, we largely benefited by the work of a government or two in the 1990s and early 2000s to reduce our debt to GDP. So we had the fiscal room to have these supports. But we want future generations to have also fiscal room to deal with future crises. So again, there's going to have to be this bigger conversation about, around debt. And could that be masking an austerity exercise in the future? I think, yeah. So it's either we're going to cut some of these spending programs, including public service pensions, or we're going to raise taxes, or some combination of the two.
I want to get to a larger and again a more philosophical question, and I think we have time to do that. Again, I'll encourage people to ask their questions through the chat function if they're willing and able to do that. I want to come back to the book that you wrote. We discussed this a moment ago, that the title was maybe not one you would have chosen, Unaccountable, Truth and Lies on Parliament Hill. What did you want it to be?
Yeah, Senator, I thought a better title would be The Cost of Indifference. I think around the world we've seen, certainly in the past number of years, democracies really come under strain. We've seen governments, political leaders take advantage of their powers, their executive powers, and weaken these institutions, these oversight rules. Even today, we've had this discussion. We're not involving opposition parties to the degree that they need to be operated on the fiscal supports for COVID-19. So yeah, the cost of indifference, democracy is government, for the people, by the people. So we all have to be engaged. And so yeah, we need, the cost of indifference was really a concern that we had, that people weren't paying attention.
I mean, you have said some very strong things, and I couldn't agree more, but real debate with analysis on Parliament Hill is virtually dead. We have settled into a place of indifference, and that includes civil servants, that you just have to kind of offer up to the minister of the day a couple of options, see what they choose. The minister's going to change anyway. Next time there's a cabinet shuffle, blah, blah, blah. I will change my department and pretty soon I'll retire out. that's even internally in the system, but also that very fundamental question of trust that the Canadian public looks at. Who am I going to vote for? Are they really substantially different? Watching the debate last night, as you kind of highlight, I mean, for the younger generation, the millennials looking at two old white guys in suits, not really inspiring.
No, yeah, I agree. That book was written a number of years ago. I think 2013, 14. So yeah, has much changed? Probably not. I think to some degree, there's been a lot more books out about, concerns about democracies around the world, and more just this sort of turn towards more authoritarian style leaders. So again, like one of the great questions we got today was a question about, more support for households to understand financial literacy. And again, I have the opportunity to work with, teach students some public finance courses, and just like, how do these institutions work? Why do we have checks and balances? What's behind these sorts of numbers? Are government's balance sheets different than household balance sheets? These sort of fundamental questions. I think we need more of that kind of participation. And yeah, I think it's time for bold thinking, really, as we kind of go forward. I think there's upside and downside risks to the economy, but like, there's some pretty significant downside risks. And after this global pandemic, that the economy is going to be incredibly weak. When people look at these numbers, we've seen business investment really going nowhere for a number of years now in Canada, but in other parts of the world. We know that, we've seen double-digit unemployment rates for short periods of time, but we know that we're losing, and we need to kind of readapt people in terms of their skills. So yeah, getting people involved in these debates, and unfortunately, we have good senators like yourself and other good legislatures in Canada. So yeah, we want you engaging Canadians over the next little while, hopefully encouraging those sorts of bold ideas, and really lighting some fires on our public servants to kind of look at bold ideas as well.
How do we do that? Is it going to come? I mean, later today, I'm having a discussion with teachers who teach civics and public institutional ideas to their students. So how does Parliament work? I know I went through a school system where I didn't know anything about how the Canadian political system functioned, nor that it was different from the US, our largest neighbor and trading partner. And that was a process that I learned through journalism, not through school. So we need to start this way back. Yeah.
I think your own story, to the extent that I know it, is certainly somebody that has been very open-minded, self-learner, self-motivated. You came from very kind of a small rural area in Saskatchewan, and then you were a major journalist for Canada, now a senator. You're dealing with these complicated issues. I think it starts as individuals. Like, we all have to take what's behind some of these issues. Should I be concerned about democracy? What is democracy? Should I be concerned about climate change? Pick up books, chat groups, podcasts. I think it really has to be done at the individual level. And fortunately, we have senators like you that will encourage us to do so.
All right. Do you actually see the importance of, I don't know, maybe I don't know when we will get to the end of this, of some really significant assessment of what we've gone through, our preparedness, our ill preparedness, how governments respond, what levels of government. I mean, we're seeing all the constitutional issues of this country displayed in dealing with this pandemic. Health, provincial jurisdiction, transportation, all of these issues are coming to play. Can we use that if we had a proper parliamentary, independent assessment of what we did right, what we did wrong, what went wrong, whether our response was adequate and fast enough, all of those things? Do we need that?
Yes. Yeah, I think there's so many lessons that we can learn from this crisis and how we responded. It was, I think one of the titles in the government's SFT was the use of the word resilience. And so, yeah, we've been, our institutions, I think our nation has been, this is, in Canada, but around the world, like, we've taken, this has been extraordinary times. So what are those lessons learned? How do we better prepare for the next shock? We had a global financial crisis in 2008-9. Now we have a global pandemic. A few years ago, I think the World Economic Forum said their chances of having a global pandemic was, they rated us in the top 10 risks, but were we really ready for that? So on these bigger issues like climate change, we don't have a plan, like to hit our 2030 targets. There is no plan for 2050 targets. On some of these big questions like, income support, safety nets of the future, getting the balance right so that we're helping, deal with income, creating opportunities, but also support for people that lose their jobs in an economy where the nature of work changes fundamentally. So these big debates, I think you could see that in some of the support programs, like the CERB program, trying to be a kind of a partial temporary stopgap income support measure. But I think at the same time, you could be optimistic as well for the most part, because who would have thought that we would have had such, a year ago, no one was expecting this pandemic really to play out. Who would have thought that governments could have produced 30 or 40 different programs, putting out better part of $250 billion in direct fiscal supports, all these liquidity supports from crown corporations, as the government analytics says, upwards of $1 trillion. And yet we did it, right? And I think, again, years down the road, we'll probably be able to assess what a difference that made. And I think when you look at these global numbers, you look at Canada in an IMF context with other countries, we put a very large fiscal supports, very large liquidity supports, larger than most other countries. Our increase in the deficit will probably rank as one of the largest, year-to-year increases in the deficit. Will it make a difference? Will it reduce the amount of scarring? By that it means, can we improve business investment in the future because we haven't lost so many businesses? Can we, more quickly restore our labor market because we've kept people whole, in terms of, household bankruptcies, et cetera. So we need that analysis, Senator, and we need the Senate to, and the House of Commons to actually lead that away. But if we don't learn lessons, it would be a tragedy.
That's some of the things are so obvious. A light being shone on how we deal with seniors and the residential circumstances that we foist upon them and charge lots of money for. You've talked about the programs, your view of something like a guaranteed annual income in some form. Do you think that now is going to go for, that's an idea that is going to be embraced? We saw so many people that were not months away from bankruptcy or losing their home or being thrown out of their apartment, but weeks away. We've got an awful lot of people that are living very close to the edge.
I think, in terms of changing our fundamental safety net in this country, I think it's going to be part of this conversation that I think we need the federal government to work with provinces and municipalities and other stakeholder groups. I don't see it happening in the short term. I don't think it just flows quickly from the CERB program. And so sometime in 2021-22, we'll have a universal basic income program. But there's been some of your colleagues like Senator Siegel, former Senator Siegel, has been, and Eggleton have been real leaders on this front. And again, these are people that have, different political backgrounds. And so I think it probably is the future, but it's kind of like, can I envision what carbon prices will look like when, when we quadruple the price? No. And a year ago, could have been pictured what Canada would look like in the middle of a global pandemic, having lost 10,000 people, unfortunately, because of this virus. But I can't see it, but I think for sure it's going to happen. We don't really have a choice but to deal, but reduce the amount of carbon in our atmosphere. We're going to need better supports because the workforce is fundamentally different than when my dad, worked in these sorts of pulp and paper mills and in forest industries. When, these are long-term jobs, pensions, and that sorts of thing. We have, a lot of workforce is fundamentally different, more small businesses, more part-time workers. So we need very different income support programs. I think Senator Siegel will be proven to be a man way ahead of his time.
He'll be happy to hear you say that. Kevin Page, I want to say as we wrap up right now that on behalf of everybody who is listening, I want to thank you for your service. When you have civil servants who work through the Department of Finance and the Treasury Board and Privy Council, of your stature with your brain power, it is really very, very important. Now you're running a think tank, the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, and I do think those things must stay joined at the hip. You can't have those discussions separate from one another. So and you fielded all these questions today, a full range. You've done an amazing job. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Senator, for the kind words, and really just thank you for your time. It's so great to spend an hour with you.